Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 10th episode of Chebacco Chats. I'm joined today by Professor Mark Silk, Professor of Religion and Public Life at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Mark, thank you for joining us. Good to have you join us on Chebacco Chats.
Well, delighted to be here, Tim.
And we're going to talk about a episode from the 2019 issue of Chebacco. That was our issue that focused on religious stories, but we felt that we had a connection because our focus today is on the William Foy story. Elder Foy was a major religious figure in American life and a local resident of Hancock County. So we wanted to invite Mark back to talk to us about this fascinating man, William Foy. Mark, would you begin by reading a paragraph from the opening paragraph to your essay?
Sure. Around 1867, according to George E. Street's 1905 History of Mount Desert, quote, a colored evangelist, Reverend William E. Foy, organized at Otter Creek a church of 25 members to be known as a Christian church, unquote, unquote. That is the extent of what Street, a congregational minister, has to say about perhaps the most consequential figure in American religious history ever to reside in Hancock County. But we should not be surprised. Foy had made his mark more than 2 decades before he appeared in Otter Creek, and his historical significance is even today recognized by very few. So that's the opening of the article. And
yes, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about how you encountered this story. You were invited to participate in this issue, and you came across this single sentence, and the single paragraph from George Street. He's sort of a go-to historian of Mount Desert Island. The book was published posthumously in 1905, but he himself was a minister, and as he wrote his history, he often focused on the religious life of the community. But this story took you down a lot of different rabbit holes to discover what was behind it.
Well, it did. I mean, I was intrigued. The editor of the issue, Lee Schmidt, asked me to write something for it, but then the question was what to write, and he said, "Well, you can get some background by reading Street on religion on Mount Desert." And so I did, and I came across this one sentence, and I thought, well, this is a curiosity, to have a Black evangelist with a congregation, even for a short time, or who knows, in Otter Creek, which is, of course, just down the road past Bar Harbor from where we are here on the island. And so I began poking around, and thanks to the miracles of Google, found that he was really quite an interesting character. And I suppose I should say a few words about that, Tim.
Yeah, tell us who was William Foy?
So he was a native Mainer. He grew up outside of Augusta there were small African-American communities, and he was converted. People had conversions regularly in those days in Maine, as well as elsewhere around the country, and still today, to become what was called a Free Will Baptist by a prominent Free Will Baptist minister whose name was Silas Curtis. And Free Will Baptists, what that means is that they were Baptists who were not Calvinists. They believed not that you were predestined to be saved or not saved, but rather that God offered grace to all, and it was up to your exercise of your own free will to avail yourself of that grace in order to be saved. So human will had something to do in salvation for these folks. I think one of the things that almost certainly attracted the young William Foy to this denomination was that they were strong abolitionists and believed very much in the equality of the races. And Silas Curtis himself becomes president of the denomination's abolitionist society. Foy goes off as he grows up and is studying apparently to become an Episcopal priest in Boston when he has a couple of sort of overwhelming spiritual experiences. He belongs to some African-American congregations he attends them in Boston, and he falls down in early 1842 a couple of times, once for hours, once for somewhat less time. While he's in church and when he's woken up from this kind of state, he recounts visions that he has of people sort of on their way being received into heaven. And this seems to be connected to his signing on with the big sort of apocalyptic or millennialist movement of the day, which was called Millerism. I guess I'll say a couple words about Millerism. There was a farmer, a Baptist named William Miller, who believed that the end of that Jesus Christ was about to return to earth, and he went so far, as such people sometimes do, as to predict dates, and eventually the date in question became, after some recalculation, October 22nd, 1844. And in the period leading up to that, Foy, who associated himself with this movement, and people from different denominations did, became a famous preacher going around New England talking about this near approach, as they called it, of Christ, his return. This was a controversial movement. There were people who were, clergy, settled clergy, who were very much opposed to it. And there were people from many denominations who joined, and many denominations did not want any part of it. And he is written up in fact, he goes and moves back to Maine and is living in Portland, is written up in one of the Portland papers in a way that I'm not going to quote. It's in the essay. It's very racist. There was clearly plenty of racism around in Maine at the time. Anyway, he preaches these visions as a sign that, as evidence of the Millerite gospel, so to say, or news. In doing that preaching, he's in Portland. One of his auditors was a teenage girl named Ellen Hammond, who was very much affected by this preaching. She goes on to become the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination. And in fact, talks about how influential Foy was on her own preaching. Ellen Hammond becomes Ellen White. She writes up her own visions, and these visions track the early ones that Foy himself published. Now, it's important to sort of understand the sequence of events. October 22nd, 1844 came and went without the return of Christ. This was a big disappointment to the Millerites, and in fact, they called it the Great Disappointment. And many of them left the fold and went back to their other denominations or whatever they did. But some sort of kept the faith in a way, and they ultimately became followers of Ellen White and the Adventists.
So Mark, how does a sect like the Millerites recover from such a great disappointment and go on. You say people left, but now Ellen White becomes influential, and now I think you mentioned in your article that Seventh-day Adventists, who have their origins in the Millerite movement, constitute 20 million people.
Right. I mean,
How does a denomination recover from such a disappointment?
Well, it's interesting. There's a famous book of sort of social psychology called "When Prophecy Fails," and it was written in the early 50s and followed a millennialist sect that was similar to this, only much smaller, in which people believed the end of the world was about to come. The prophecy failed, and yet people hold on to the community. They hold on to something similar happens actually with Jehovah's Witnesses, where the community comes to be important in various ways, and people hold on to the beliefs but adjust them in ways that that make sense. So maybe Christ did return, but in a way that we didn't expect and didn't see, and now we're living in a new dispensation. There are various ways to sort of, one might say, rationalize this, but they do continue. However, our guy, William Foy, is one of the people who does not continue with the Millerites. He does not become a Seventh-day Adventist, and so his influence on Ellen White gets sort of lost and covered up by the early historians of the Adventists. Here's you've just put up a comparison of the vision that one of the visions that Foy had with his own account of it. If you look at, and then you can look at White's own version, and you see, for example, Foy uses the term glittering hinges, and which is also used by White. You know, one has to sort of try to understand how books of prophecy or prophecies can be imitated, either insincerely or sincerely. They can be internalized. You know, how one understands the closeness of the two accounts depends on interpretation. And if you're inside the fold, as the people in 1845, when these were published, or I guess White's were in 1846, it was, well, it's amazing that they had the same vision. They must have seen the same thing. In fact, White's own account later was that Foy, when he heard about White's vision, said, you know, I saw exactly the same thing.
So a modern day cynic might say this is evidence of plagiarism. A believer might say that this is confirmation of the validity of the vision, that they are so consistent.
Right, and a religion scholar might say something in between.
Go there.
Well, in the sense that White may have read Foy, she probably did read Foy's account, or she heard Foy give this account. She could have internalized it. She could have dreamt about it. She could have, in fact, seen much the same thing in her dreams. That's what, or these kinds of things. One thinks of the things that pop up in one's own dreams that are things that occurred to one, or that one read, or whatever. It's not. I don't want to say here, and I couldn't say that this was sort of a question of sitting down with his text and just copying it out with some significant, some changes into her own account. These are complicated kinds of questions, and ones that are ultimately unresolvable. Maybe she just saw the same thing.
Well, so Ellen White and the Millerite movement goes off in its own fascinating direction, and William Foy goes in another. And let's follow William Foy, because it eventually brings him to Mount Desert Island.
Correct. he next turns up, and we know this from census data, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He's pastoring a mixed race congregation. New Bedford was a major stop on the Underground Railway. This was right in the we know he was there in 1850. 1850 was the year of the Fugitive Slave Act, and the Underground Railroad was functioning at a high level. He was connected again, if he had ever left it, with the Free Will Baptists, who in fact they have an annual meeting in 1851 or two, at which there's a black minister from the South who is sort of on the run from slave captures. I mean, this is very much at that critical point in American history when Northerners really understand their own implication in the slave system, and somewhat similar to. I think it's interesting that today we just had the DACA decision from the Supreme Court, that in a way that some of the northern cities, some cities around the country are acting as sanctuary cities. So at that time, places like Boston and other cities were functioning as sanctuaries, warning people against Southern slave catchers. I mean, it was a rather similar time. So Foy is there for a while. And then he moves back to Maine again, becomes an itinerant evangelist, going from place to place. And eventually in the course of his travels, he ends up in Otter Creek, establishing this church for 25 people. We don't know exactly how long he was there. We don't have a building. We don't have independent records other than Street's own pretty good account, even if it's so brief. I mean, he's got the denomination right, Free Will Baptists. He's got the dating right, because what we know is that few years after he's talking, and we don't actually have the year, he doesn't give it, Foy buys some property in East Sullivan, and that's where he spends the rest of his life. He lives until 1892, and we have records of him in the place where he lived there. We know that his connections remained significant with Mount Desert, to the extent that he owned a wagon, and there's an item in one of the Bar Harbor newspapers that this wagon of his was broken up by a runaway horse that ran off with it. The likelihood is that he owned a wagon that was let out for rent, the way such wagons were for people who wanted to move goods and persons around the island in those days. And we have records of him preaching in schoolhouses. There was a hall in Sullivan that he preached that was owned by a group called the Good Templars, who were a progressive organization that was open to women preachers as well as African American ones. And he becomes a real fixture in the community. We have some wonderful reminiscences of people who go out of their way years later, decades after he died, to remember Elder Foy, as he was called, as a beloved member of their community. It's a really interesting picture of sort of rural white Mainers who adopt, who accept, in a way that might be surprising to people in the late 19th century, a Black evangelist, invite him around regularly to stay at their houses as he's doing these preaching sessions in schoolhouses in the area. And he eventually dies. His tombstone can be seen in Sullivan. Gary and Jean Edwards, who run the Historical Society over there, were extremely helpful in taking me and my wife around to see the tombstone and to actually provide us with some interesting new data that didn't exist I mean, that was unknown in the way of reminiscences about Foy. So, and he has been sort of rediscovered by the Adventists themselves, particularly a couple, a father and son, um, African-American Adventists who've recovered Foy's story. And I think I've added a few things that they didn't have to it, but he's becoming known as really the important precursor of their denomination.
And you've encountered in the fragments of information that you were able to pick up, you were able to piece together a pretty good sense of his place in society. Going back to the wagon story, where there's an accident, and that makes the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
There was a wealthy summer resident present there who later hosted the President of the United States. And you get some insights into maybe what his place in the community was, and the interactions between such a man as Reverend
Mm-hmm.
Foy and other white Americans that were living on the island. What can you share your insights there?
Yeah, I mean, there's this guy named Alec Palmer, who was a wealthy, well-connected Washingtonian, an Episcopalian. He had been president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, U.S. Consul General in Dresden, Germany, and he's building a cottage in Otter Creek, and a guy who seems to have worked for him, probably building it, for some reason has hold of Foy's wagon, and the horse runs off with it, and Foy ends up getting recompensed by him. He pays for the wagon that's been destroyed. So we have a picture of sort of Foy as one of the sort of local people there. But Palmer goes on to host at this cottage when it's built President Benjamin Harrison, who comes to visit Mount Desert, and there's an elaborate account in the New York Times about this champagne party. Even though Maine was a dry state, they didn't have any trouble pouring champagne. They had imported flowers. They had, quite the affair. And meanwhile, in Sullivan, there's a little item in the local paper here on Mount Desert about a picnic that the locals were having in plantation number 7, which was where Foy lived, and the account, is a lovely one, and ends up by saying Elder Foy gave a short and appropriate address. It was a day that will long be remembered by young and old. And so this is the sort of upstairs, downstairs picture of rusticators and wealthy people from outside, and then people who are in the community. And it's worth mentioning just here that that Sullivan, that part of Hancock County, was very closely connected to Mount Desert, because the ferries went from Hancock Point, and it just took 20 minutes or so for a steam ferry to go back and forth. I mean, I'd be looking out my window at steam ferries moving back and forth all the time if we were here 150 years ago. So in that sense, I mean, what is likely to seem now more remote by car was actually pretty close in terms of the mainland.
Hey, I want to invite our audience to send in questions, and either right on the Facebook Live page or on our Zoom connection. And Cynthia asks, do we know any of the names of Foy's Otter Creek congregants? I'm a descendant of many original Otter Creek families, chief amongst them Walls and then Davis.
So far as, all we know really, all that I've been able to find out about this congregation is that there were 25 members. Whether now it's conceivable that the person who was involved with the broken wagon might have been connected to Foy, if one wants to go that way. He was a religious guy known as Deacon Thomas, Mr. David Thomas. He lived in Otter Creek next not far from Palmer. It was in front of his house that the wagon was parked. And it's possible that, and Thomas's, you can find his tombstone in the Otter Creek Cemetery. So that's the closest I could get. I've asked our longtime plumber, Hillard Walls of Otter Creek, whether he'd ever heard of any of this. And his memory doesn't serve. So we'll have to, I just have nothing more to contribute.
Well, there may be information that families have, and even after we publish, we're just a little disappointed that information surfaces after we publish the article, but it happens all the time because it gets people thinking about such things. And in fact, you encountered such a situation when you came across a memoir written by a woman in Ellsworth, and she remembered a man she knew as Elder Foy from when she was a little girl.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting. This is a reminiscence, an 8-page typescript reminiscence written 50 years ago this year in 1970 by a woman who grew up as Letty Moore. Her married name was Pryor, and she was born in 1884, and so that would have been 8 years before Foy died. And she writes, the first elder I can remember was Elder Foy. She has him living in Surrey, Maine, which was a mistake. But she says he was a colored man, quite tall and large-framed. I think one would call him a circuit preacher. Elder Foy was a kind Christian man. He came to our community 3 or 4 times a year and usually spent about 2 weeks with us. Besides that Sunday service, he usually had prayer meeting 2 or more nights each week that he was there. I think he probably visited different families. I can remember his eating dinner and spending some time in our homes. And that's how it worked in those days. You would go around. It's an interesting story. She lived up near the Otis line, and presumably this was sort of normal church for people in that area at the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, well, our half hour races by. I want to invite our audience to join us next week because we have the executive director of Mount Desert Island Historical Society, Rainey Bench, also digging back into the Chebacco archive. She will be talking about her article titled Maine's Gone Mad, The Rising of the Klan. Many people are surprised to know that the Ku Klux Klan was quite active in Maine and this part of Maine and the island. And I think Rainey's article is probably the most referenced of any we've ever published in Chebacco. So I hope you can join us next week. I think as we dig into these past issues, we just have it seems like a bottomless supply of interesting content that you can look forward to. So Mark, thank you very much for joining us. It was great hearing your interest in Reverend Foy, this prominent African-American man who resided among us. And we really appreciate you telling us what you've learned.
Well, this has been great fun. And I look forward to tuning in to the other shows.
Well, and to our audience, thank you for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week.